Hey there, I'm Catalina Villegas. I'm the host of Rolli's Experts Explain Everything podcast. Rolli is the platform where journalists find experts for their stories. It is created by journalists for journalists. And as a journalist myself, I love to find fascinating people on Rolli, experts with so much knowledge and insight, and yet it rarely makes it past the headlines. So I'm bringing on one of those experts to answer all the burning questions I've ever had about their field. Today I'm chatting with Tracy Raczek. She's a principal at TR Climate. She is a climate policy expert, having worked as a climate strategist for the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in the lead-up to the Paris Climate Accord, and she now advises companies and foundations on climate change. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Tracy, tell me just, if you could, briefly a little bit about how you ended up working at the UN and next to a figure like Secretary General Ban Ki-moon.
Sure. Thanks so much for that introduction. And I was really, I don't like to touch too long on our own personal journeys because everybody's life is incredible, as I like to say. My journey to the UN was an enjoyable one. I was raised by parents and an extended family who were really passionate about the environment and human rights. I have the typical degrees in, major in poli-sci, master's in international relations. So maybe that's a bit common. I had a little bit of a less traditional career, though, before landing at the UN, and it included some almost 7 years technical work in the field, living in a tent, for many of those, and then landed at the UN in my later life, and pretty quickly recognized that climate change, I had an environmental degree or classes in my education, but pretty soon recognized that this was the forum to really try and tackle this, global and pressing issue. And so I started working on gender action and climate change in UN Women. Before that was called UNIFEM. And then was sort of tapped, if you will, by the Secretary General's office to work in both on the SDG, a report for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and then later on his climate team.
Now, there are a lot of different concerns when it comes to climate change, but I want to touch specifically on geoengineering. Can you tell us what is geoengineering and how does it work?
Sure, absolutely. So as I imagine lots of your listeners know, global warming has been ratcheting up quite rapidly, according to the most recent science by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which consists of over 200 scientists, so it's nothing to shake a stick at. The average global temperature over land and sea surface has increased already about 1 degree Celsius, or almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, if you will, since the pre-industrial era. So this is since in the last 120 years or so. Because of this rapid rise, and of course all of the severe hazards that are anticipated to come as the temperature rises, more storms, droughts, wildfires, food security issues, water security issues, etc. There's been a conversation that's pivoted, if you will, from just trying to mitigate climate emissions, so lower emissions from various sectors, industry, transportation, agriculture, etc., to sort of a more sweeping technological solution of what's called geoengineering. When it was first brought out, as a possible solution, it was a catch-all phrase for loads of different means that the planet could either be manipulated at various levels to become a sink for carbon or absorb more carbon, or simultaneously to reflect more radiation back into space. As in the last maybe 10 years or so, those various means, which can be quite broad in scope, have been parsed out a bit more wisely into ones that relate to land use. So things like, deforestation or soil sequestration, the potential of soil to absorb carbon, how we use our land wisely or not to be a sink for carbon. So that's sort of one big category. And frankly, that one's maybe less of a concern because a lot of that resorts to just wise use of our natural resources. The other category that really deals more with technology to interrupt or to alter natural processes is increasingly a concern. And we can get more into that. But what they but they tend to fall into a few categories. As I mentioned, one is solar radiation, so trying to stop the heat warming rays of the sun from getting into the atmosphere. That's done through various ways, like spraying aerosols into the sky, possibly putting in reflective metallic balloons, space mirrors, that sort of thing, or even little particles on the ice caps so that they reflect the solar radiation back into space. Another category is to increase the reflectivity in the lower atmosphere, maybe protecting some coral reefs or some ice, some ice, but in the lower atmosphere. There's a third category of collecting carbon through plants, through power plants or other technologies, and injecting it into the deep ocean waters. That's sort of like most simply put is like either a giant carbon vacuum cleaner in the sky or placing them at power plants so that as industries emit carbon, it can immediately be captured and injected. These technologies are really on the frontier of how we can affect the planet. So how they're managed, by who, is really critical in this juncture. It's similar, I compare it a bit to what the Industrial Revolution was like. So began with a few countries, benefited a few countries much more than others, and who's responsible for how that power is distributed ever since is, there's a big reason why we're battling a lot of the global climate change issues we have now. So again, we're on a similar threshold. We really need to learn from that past and do better going forward.
Now, I feel like a lot of this geoengineering, to me, it sounds like science fiction, right? Like these, it does, like the mirrors and the aerosols and the cloud seeding. I don't know, it just sounds like something from, a movie, like something like fan fiction, like something so far-fetched, but it's actually happened, as I understand, and dozens of countries are already testing and working with these types of technologies. Is that right?
Absolutely. So the pilots for these sort of global scale methodologies, the aerosols, the solar radiation techniques, et cetera, these are being piloted by maybe a dozen or so countries. But in the same vein, there's a category of weather modification where, say, a country is battling drought, or they want to create more snowpack, or they want to make sure that floods, the hurricane is deflected from their shores. All of those sorts of technologies are called weather modification. But as we face climate change, the line between these is growing ever more thin, and I would say it's disappeared. Because climate change puts stress on people's, their agriculture, their livelihoods, their safety. What was once deemed a technology that would have very local reach now can absolutely have implications for neighboring communities and neighboring countries. And this is where the line of climate, technologies that affect the climate and weather are really getting muddied up. And we need to think better and smarter about this before, as you mentioned, we get into a dystopian science world where a few countries own or use a lot of the technology to possible damage of others. And, you're right that 50 countries actually use weather modification technology, and there's already some tension rising between those countries, some countries.
Yeah, that's right. I read one of your recent articles that pointed out there is some tension in the Middle East happening with this. There's two things about this that concern me a little bit. One is obviously that relationship with your neighbor next door. I mean, for those smaller countries that are messing with weather, I can definitely see that kind of trickling over into neighboring countries and the impact on that and those relationships. But then also, I don't know, nature is it's its own force. It's a little bit like, what are we messing with here? Do we really know the true implications of taking on nature?
Yeah, really, really good points. And all this technology can't control weather, but it can artificially alter it. China artificially does this already in major cities. They plan to do it over half of its terrain in 2025. India has expressed tension about this. As the Arctic melts, basically, and there's interests by some countries. Russia has expressed it to benefit from this melting. If others actually play with the Arctic ice to prevent it from melting, what kind of tensions could that rise to? And so this is, Iran has accused Israel of cloud seeding and stealing water. There's a lot of examples. And even in the United States, some states that are downwind from others that are cloud seeding to increase their chance of precipitation. Downwind states have actually, cried foul, like, are you potentially stealing our water from our crops, etc. So there, I think I'm similarly concerned. It's actually one of the reasons I wrote this article. And I think, the having worked in the UN for over 10 years, I recognize the value of that institution to create global norms, using the soft power of the Secretary General's office, but also using a little bit more of a stick approach with the Security Council or some agreements that are more binding. And to address this issue, there's been hemming and hawing and debate and think tanks, et cetera, about what is the best way to address it. Some countries, frankly, find benefit in it being loosely governed. Others find value in having it be more adroitly and staunchly governed, if you will. There is a precedent of, that I argue about which convention or UN body could be used for this, and maybe we want to go into that. But there is a route out. There is a wise route out. It's just member states have to be willing to. Member states, mean countries in the UN, need to be willing to tackle it.
Let's get into that specifically. And I think what you're referring to is the EndMod Convention. And I had never heard of this before. Can you tell us a little bit what EndMod refers to and how that may play a part in now parsing out who gets to control their weather, when and how it impacts their neighbors?
Absolutely. So, this convention, I call it a convention that's sort of been in the backwaters of the UN since the Cold War, height of the Cold War. So the long title is the Convention, which just means an agreement on the prohibition of military or any other hostile use of environmental modification technique. So it was designed in the Cold War after the United States basically, loads of research show evidence of this. It was even debated at Congress, but America meddled with the rain patterns over North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and Laos in an attempt to try and alter the rainfall patterns so that they could flood military routes and thwart, the movement of the Viet Cong. So they did it over a period of about 5 years in the late 60s and early 70s. And soon afterwards, the international community recognized, whoa, this is a really new frontier of possible weaponry that is quite indiscriminate, right? So it could possibly damage civilians' livelihoods or, flood their home. There's a lot of extra damage that could be done to collateral damage, if you will. And so recognizing this, the UN gathered together, especially led by the Cold War superpowers, Russia and the US, and they hammered out this convention to limit the use of weather modification technology. What's interesting about this is that, there's so many things that are interesting about it. But one is that, by the way, 78 countries have now joined. So it's wasn't just a handful of countries. A good half of the world roughly have joined it. But what's interesting about this is three things. One is that the Article 1 and 2, the definitions that are used, which is typically at the front of any agreement, define sort of the parameters about what they're talking about. And in this case, they're talking about technology that is it's like similar, if not exactly, climate geoengineering. So it's techniques that have widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects. And it's also any deliberate manipulation of natural processes, including the dynamics, composition of the Earth's structure, including the atmosphere. And so this is what geoengineering does. And the third part that's most interesting is very equally interesting, is that it's trying to address the hostile use of these types of technologies. And it's a bit vague. It's sort of in Cold War terminologies about what is hostile intent or what is peaceful intent. And this is where, this convention, among the handful of others that have been debated whether or not it's a good fit, this is the one that's best suited for this geoengineering, because it clearly, the definitions fit. It's really, it's already received support from the superpowers of the Cold War. And the issue of hostile and peaceful are what we're talking about now, what we need to parse out. The other handful or so of conventions that folks have been debating whether or not they should govern this technology are really non-starters. They only relate in part, about how it's related to biodiversity, or will it really effectively impact the climate change, but they don't really relate to the very important issue of security. How could this technology possibly affect neighbors and adversely and be used maliciously or with hostile intent? And these are the critical questions going forward.
No doubt, critical questions, and also concerning to a certain extent. I feel like that's the next frontier of warfare. If you can impact somebody else's, whether to a high degree, you could really have a really huge impact on their population. So it's so important that this convention took place, that there's already a guideline of what should and shouldn't be done, and now this could be a stepping stone to get us on the right path in terms of how do we use geoengineering to help us tackle climate change. Would you say that's about correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And, in addition to, the questions about how it or if it could be used, maliciously or with hostile intent, what's very handy about this, and I say internationally handy about this convention, is that it actually says if there are complaints about the potentiality of this being used, with hostile intent, they can be referred to the Security Council. I can't think of a single other convention that allows for this. And as you probably know, in the UN system, the Security Council is the only body that actually has it can be enforced. And so there's some teeth to this convention that all the others don't have. And, imagine as well if it was a handful, even if, it's decision making is not always made with equanimity. So what if a handful of governments who are more powerful decide, oh no, we want to do geoengineering this way. And, there can be regional and local impacts that differ depending on the geoengineering use. And not to be an alarmist, but what if those techniques benefited that handful of countries a bit more than the rest of the world, or a lot more? You really, you can start going down this road of, danger. Well, we need to be smart and think ahead about this technology before we're retroactively trying to mitigate the damage that's been done.
Do you think geoengineering is going to be our solution to climate change?
Frankly, I hope not. The IPCC reports that have explored at least the technological versions, not the land use versions, where, better use of forests, smarter agriculture, et cetera. The geoengineering solutions that are the technological ones that I'm referring to, about aerosols, metal balloons going, aluminum compound balloons going into the sky, all of these, the IPCC is very clear that the impacts to ecosystems, biodiversity, water, clean air, they're so far from being understood. And they may never be able to be understood because of the complexities of the climate. And we talk in climate change about wild cards. There's, the Antarctic ice shelf, the loss of the Brazilian, the Amazon, or the oceanic currents. These are, if these change past certain thresholds, the damage to our planet as we know it is just catastrophic. And those are, if we were to also add another wild card of this sorts of geoengineering technology without being able to understand all of the knock-on effects, it's really, really, really risky. I think it's too risky. It's much smarter to spend our time and money on even managed retreat or better adaptation, or there's a lot of resources that are needed to go in different places where it's more predictable, it's more equitable, and just plain smarter. So I think that this is going down this road of technological geoengineering is a bad decision.
What you just said brought something to mind, and kind of brings it full circle in some ways. When you were working at the UN, you worked next to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon leading up to the Paris Climate Accord. And just recently, the current Secretary General said that the Paris Climate Accord is basically on life support, saying that the most basic tenets of this agreement are not being adhered to. And we are on a path right now to not meeting those goals, which could have catastrophic implications for the environment. And I wonder if we're just starting to tinker with this geoengineering, and this doesn't seem like it could potentially be this kind of solution to climate change, but we're also not willing to do the basic things that we agreed to in the Paris Climate Accord. What are we willing to do?
Yeah, yeah. I don't mean to laugh. That's a really serious and important question, and it's critical. I think the Secretary General is right that a lot of our climate action is on life support. If you layer all the climate policies that are already in place around the world, we're on track for about 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming by middle of the century. And if every country, alternatively, if every country pulls off its net zero emission targets, which are basically reduce, and anything that you can't reduce for emissions, you capture through other ways, through the land use, et cetera, hopefully. Even then, our global average temperature rise only goes to 1.8. So we are almost undoubtedly going to pass this 1.5 threshold. And while there are a lot of good stories out there to be told about renewable energy, electric vehicles, carbon-free steel and cement, people's behaviors are starting to change, shareholders and investments are moving. There's a lot of good that's being done by all sectors of society. Nonetheless, the speed at which things need to be done is really, it's tough. It's a really tough one, and the lowest emitting countries need a lot of support. They're not getting it. So there's a lot of work ahead to be done. Absolutely. He is right. But there is some positive work out there that's being done.
What keeps you up at night?
I guess I worry about two things. I worry about probably the general imbalance of power right now, which is affecting critical processes and decision making. Low income countries, they're listened to in the forum of the climate change process, absolutely, because they're on the front lines. But nonetheless, they still have, like I mentioned, receive insufficient funds to adapt or to have a green transition. Much of what they do receive in funds are loans, which should be untenable due to the history of emissions by high-income countries. Also, low-income communities don't have enough power. Then simultaneously, if they did have more power, they could be informing laws, regulations that would be smarter, they'd be able to adapt better, etc. And then also the power dynamics about a few countries and too few philanthropic institutions who are dominating the process. And that's a bit of a sensitive subject, and glad to go into that in more detail in another time. But right now, there's so many critical junctures we're at, and the power is in too few hands. On a very personal note, the second thing that just makes me incredibly sad is the projected loss of biodiversity. Of course, I'm super sad about the impacts on humans and their livelihoods, and it's there's tragic stories shared every day. It's hard to not think about Ukraine as well right now, but there's other climate impacts on people. But I haven't been an environmentalist and done forestry work for a long time, and it just makes me really sad, the projections for biodiversity loss. Even at 1.5, we're looking at up to about 10% of terrestrial species likely going extinct. And that number ratchets up quite dramatically as you get closer to higher temperatures. So I don't want to scare. Yeah. If we, for example, the recent IPCC impacts adaptation and vulnerability report mentioned that if we get up to 5-degree average, increase, help us if we do. That's absolutely horrible. But we're looking at close to 50% of terrestrial species going extinct of those surveyed. Granted, it was not comprehensive of the whole planet, but they were emblematic of what we're looking at. And it's I think of the generations to come, and we have a beautiful planet.
Yeah.
Despite its sorrow, and I just makes me sad.
Absolutely.
I hope we don't end on that note.
No, I actually, let's end on a better note. I would like to, because we have talked about so many things, some concerning, some alarming, some really sad. So let's see if we can end on a happy note. Is there anything good that you feel really excited about, that you feel like, there's some hope here? Leave us with a little bit of hope, Tracy.
Yeah. Well, the good news about the geoengineering, one piece of good news is this NMOD convention has in it an article that requires it to be revisited or reviewed at certain intervals, and it's up for possible review. To go through that process, they need only 10 countries to agree to this. So I'm really hoping that at least 10 countries recognize the value in this convention and want to sit around the table and think about this. It's not many. A few have already sort of hinted at interest. And the SG, the current SG, Gutierrez is passionate about climate change. And I think if he wants to, he could put his current team to the task of securing through his office, soft power, additional countries to cross that threshold and have a review. The past 2 reviews did not happen. So those were opportunities lost. But we have another one at hand in 2023, just next year. Also, on a very practical note about climate change, there's some really great stuff happening. There's investment in renewables increasing. You have, there's personal agency amongst, wealthy people living in wealthy states and wealthy individuals to make a difference. As I mentioned before, shareholder movement, like in the fossil fuel industry and many others in the U.S. and EU, they're really forcing CEOs and companies to rethink their business models and integrate climate change, and that's fantastic. And they're electric vehicles are taking off. There's many major manufacturers have been announcing that they're going electric. So there's a lot. There's a lot. We just need to keep momentum up and build it more. And as I think a lot of folks wait for the companies or the global leaders to fix everything. They do need to do a lot and their part, but simultaneously, how people choose to live, especially people of means, can and does make a difference. So I think that's important to remember. We're not just sitting around waiting for this story to end without our own input.
I like that. Absolutely. We all need to be part of writing this story, and hopefully a good story. Tracy Raczek, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for that insight.
My pleasure. It was a real pleasure. It was a joy talking with you, and glad to chat again anytime.
Awesome. You can learn a lot more about Tracy by visiting her website, tracyraczek.com. That's Tracy, RACZEK.com. And you can find hundreds of other exceptional experts at www.rolliapp.com. I'm Catalina Villegas, and you can always connect with me on social media at Catalina Official, OFFCL, on Twitter, IG, Facebook. Until next time.